Kelly.
And I'm Kyle Thompson.
And you're listening to General Intellect Unit. And in this episode, we're going to be kind of touching on a couple of themes that we've covered in a few places before. Specifically, we're going to be talking about this article that came out very recently called "Microsoft and the Yeoman Coders," which is published in Jacobin and written by Gavin Mueller. And we'll also be kind of reading from a few sort of materials that are sort of slightly related to that. But this was a sort of an interesting jumping off point to kind of talk about just open source software in general. We've wanted to talk about this for a while, but this was the opportunity to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And the sort of the core of this article that it leads off on is the acquisition by Microsoft of GitHub and what that means for coders, right? What does that mean for open source? What labor relations does that imply going forward? What organizational forms does that imply going forward? I think that this has, it's been a real sort of shock to some, I think, that Microsoft would buy GitHub, right? Because, these are traditionally sort of antithetical concepts, right? That, Microsoft has a history of being sort of incredibly hostile to open source software. And GitHub is, the hive brain of open source software out there.
Yeah. Pretty much. So for maybe a bit of clarity for the listeners, the significance of GitHub is that if you're making software, you should be using a version control system to version things properly. And one of the sort of big sort of systems for that is to use a program called Git, which basically you just commit changes into it, and it keeps this immutable record of everything that changed, so you can see the history of your project and all that sort of nice stuff. And it beats the hell out of copying the file and renaming it, whatever _1, and then having _final and all this kind of crap, and _final _1. But
yes, the sort of things that editors do.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So coders in general have a better system for this sort of stuff. But GitHub was and still is. I don't know why I referred to it in the past tense, but it's sort of a website where you can host all these Git repositories, and it kind of it had that kind of really interesting combination of essentially project hosting for open source stuff. You'd have the actual code would go there, and bug tracking and a few other little bits of project management features. But it was also a social kind of site. It was kind of the MySpace of coding or whatever.
Which is probably why Microsoft decided to acquire it, because they already own LinkedIn, so it kind of makes sense. But yes, there's that social network aspect of GitHub is essential.
Yeah, it's because when that acquisition was announced a couple of weeks ago, or I suppose by the time this airs, probably a couple of months ago. But huge consternation amongst the kind of hacker sort of community or communities. And a lot of really sort of head scratching and kind of what are we going to do now? Because I think everyone was at least subconsciously aware that the network effects of GitHub and its kind of social aspect had really drawn everyone into this this very pleasant honey trap, right? That could be acquired by a giant corporation, and it's you could kind of see these ideas crystallizing in people's minds that oh god, actually maybe this kind of centralization is kind of a bad deal, right? Because it enables this sort of sweeping takeover of a resource that is treasured by the community,
Right, and it's really quite interesting because don't want to get too far in the weeds here, but Git is an inherently decentralized way of doing version control. But what we arrived at in the industry was actually a centralized implementation of Git.
Yeah, very much so, which is kind of upsetting. But Anyway, so the author kind of goes through a bit of the history of this, like why is this such a surprising thing? And it's because, well, essentially in the development of like personal computing and software development, you have two kind of parallel tracks that developed over the last couple of decades, with one track being proprietary commercial and like corporate software, sort of like, your Microsoft and your IBM and that sort of thing, and your Oracle, to a sort of slightly lesser extent. But the other track then is like hobbyist sort of stuff of like hackers and tinkerers sort of messing with computers and like then sharing the results of what they'd found, and kind of this like grassroots sort of like hacker culture. These two different strains were like in very direct sort of conflict with each other. That, like, I mean, Bill Gates had that kind of like legendary. It's mentioned in the article, but like a letter, an open letter to the Homebrew Computing Club, basically accusing them of being thieves, right? That like, well, hardware must be paid for, and therefore software must be paid for as well. And he was setting up this dichotomy between like the professional corporate developers as like the legitimate way of doing software development, and like the hacker thing as being just like kids fucking around and like stealing stuff, which is amusing.
Right. Basically saying that, sharing is theft.
Yeah.
Right? Like,
how fucking dare they, right? Like,
we're going to get into some Proudhon later on here, but the opposite of property is theft. Is sharing is theft.
Yeah. But like this is then in like kind of contrast with like the hacker ethos, which was that like, if you're participating in this kind of this community, you have an obligation to contribute back. That like because you would have learned to like develop software by looking at the content of other people's work. So when you develop your own, it's only right to sort of contribute back and make your stuff available. Yeah,
it's the difference between a sort of copyright policed marketplace versus a intellectual commons.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Like, I think net intellectual commons is definitely the right way to put it. That like, there was this sense of like the open source movement being a like digital commons that would be like in sort of like kind of maintaining like an authentic and non-alienated form of kind of relation between the creators and the stuff they're creating. And it's actually like we'll get to it a bit later, but it's kind of debatable I think it's very debatable how true that remains today, right? Because I think you can identify at least two distinct generations of hackers, and I use the term hackers very, very broadly to kind of mean enthusiast coders and through to actual hackers in the security sense.
Right. What the term originally meant, as opposed to what the news media defined it as.
Yeah, exactly. So like the term originally meant like hacking in the sense of like using a hatchet to like chop wood and make things. That's sort of like kind of MacGyvering bits and pieces together. Like if something is a hack job, it's like a piece of furniture that you wouldn't want to actually use because it's so roughly assembled. But that's what the root of the metaphor is. But this sort of stuff was kind of exemplified by this like Richard Stallman, who is probably familiar to a lot of people who are even remotely close to computer science. But this guy was big into like creating like what he called like copyleft licenses that would like preserve like this kind of like culture and the freedoms to like use software and to publish it on the community's own terms.
Which was this real sort of like judo flip kind of maneuver that he did with copyright, right? Which he turned the copyright system against itself by making it a thing that promoted sharing instead of property hoarding.
It's really, really good and innovative stuff, and I think like it's one of those things that's worth sort of pondering is like where would we be now without Stallman? He's one of these really sort of interesting characters in that like he's quite sort of obtuse and like kind of hard to get along with, but he has this like unnerving habit of being right all the time about everything. that, like, he had so many predictions for how proprietary sort of software would be this sort of like contagious way of like entrapping people's rights. And he had, I think, like essays from the 90s about predicting things like the Amazon Kindle sort of system where you have like DRM on books and stuff. And everyone at the time thought he was a lunatic, but then like looking back, it's like, no, Stallman got it basically right. Like he got more or less a hole in one right from the start. But the copyleft bit is the interesting thing here, because it's like there's this very, very distinct split between these two completely separate worlds, and very, very antagonistic, like mutually antagonistic worlds of software development. And the one of the big things about the split is the character of how the creators and the workers actually relate to their work, right? Like that if you're in the Microsoft camp with the proprietary stuff, it is explicitly corporate, right, and explicitly capitalist, that like you perform the labor and then the product of that labor is taken away and sold by the bosses. But like on the other side, it's like this much more sort of like closer to like an artisanal relationship between the producer and the work that is produced.
Mm-hmm. Yes, at least ideally that was the idea. Which is interesting, because like it's hard to think of almost anything else really in the last half century that like actually has this kind of character and is also mainstream, like, because everything is built on this stuff now, this open source software, right? And it forms like this substrate of just like digital infrastructure that is essential to the functioning of everything. But it has this like weirdly kind of like it's sort of roots and its inspiration are this like explicitly non-capitalist sort of way of operating. Right. And I mean that does make it a matter of considerable interest. And I think what this article is sort of addressing is the contradictions that are implied with having that kind of ethos and that productive form become the backbone of contemporary capitalism, right? Like, so what does that end up doing, and what does that mean for workers?
Yeah, definitely. Like, and it's like it's kind of complex, right? Because it kind of turns out eventually that like this kind of open source stuff is actually perfectly compatible with capitalism. Like they're more than happy to get in on this stuff, because like what it ends up doing is like creating just a gigantic sort of library of like free stuff that you can build a company on. Like everything from like programming languages through to like database systems through to like networking stuff, and everything. Like, so like all of the big companies now, like, and especially the tech giants, your Facebooks and Ubers and Googles and such, are built on the back of this kind of work. But it's like, on the one hand, you can say, oh yeah, it's great that like this community effort enabled so much extra value creation. But then, were these people compensated for the work at all, or like what's their kind of fate, right? Like, what's the fortune of the people who actually created this like essential infrastructure?
It's often described as like a free rider problem, which is, I think, a sort of deceptive metaphor. It's much more the case that like this is more of a thing of like somebody coming in and just sort of taking what's there. It's like the conquest of North America kind of thing, right? Like it's more what it feels like than the free rider, because like the free rider is like always just lazy and blah blah blah. But like no, that's not really what's happening here. It's more like some people saw a tremendous business opportunity in this commons that had been developed, and was like completely unguarded to being exploited. And the development of open source as opposed to free software was a big part of that story, right? Where the development of licenses that would allow unguarded commercialization of coders' work, and that was one of the things that sort of resolved the conflict between the Microsoft style approach and the GPL Richard Stallman style approach, was to create these licenses that didn't have onerous attribution requirements and didn't have onerous requirements on corporations to open source the code that they used in production.
So like that's kind of worth explaining, where like Stallman's copyleft licenses, the most famous probably being the GPL, the GNU public license, had this kind of characteristic where they're kind of viral or contagious, where if a given work is put under that license, if it is used and modified elsewhere, then the modifier must publish the changes, which is cool when you intend for like that stuff to be kept in the open, but like makes it like very dangerous for like private companies to use. I mean, I used to work at like actually my first programming job out of university was at a shop that was like all Microsoft and fucking Windows .NET sort of contract work, and they had like just a hard rule: no GPL. Nothing is allowed in this building that's GPL because it's contagious. And that kind of, it gets at and so like to kind of finish that sort of line of thought, like there are other licenses that, like by contrast, are just like essentially just do whatever you want, like use it, whatever. It's like it's a statement that the initial release is open and free, but like you're free to do whatever afterwards, including keeping modifications to yourself. And that's the stuff that really greased the wheels for like big companies, or just companies in general, or like industry, to just start using this stuff and not worrying all that much about how the licenses do, because like there's this kind of like consistent sort of problem where, and it's related to what you were saying about like this commons being a sort of like bountiful nature into which these companies or engineers wandered and started plucking apples off the trees and such. That like it's actually really hard to keep track of what you're using in like a multi-thousand engineer like engineering department in a huge thing. So like I think it's even just a convenience thing of like we don't want to audit everything we have in order to figure out how our usage of it relates to the producer, right? Like this kind of the fundamental relation that's being discussed there.
There's an accounting overhead that is onerous, not necessarily impossible to manage, but difficult enough that avoiding it is very attractive, right?
Definitely, yeah. So I feel like we should maybe kind of circle back a little bit to this, like to the title of the article actually, and this kind of like notion of yeoman coders, and especially the contrast with the artisan term that comes up also. And like, so can you give us a definition of yeoman? Because it's a weird word that not many people have ever heard.
Yeah, so most people, when you think about the Middle Ages, you probably think about like lords and peasants, right? There's the nobility and there's the peasantry. Well, there were all kinds of different sort of castes of people in the Middle Ages, and one of them was the yeoman, and they were not peasants. They were free-holding farmers. So that means that they were not in a position of subjugation to the same degree that the peasants were. And generally speaking, the way that they sort of made their living was to do their farming, and then on top of that, they had a military obligation to some lord. So they were kind of like a well-off stratum of farmers in the Middle Ages who were fairly reliably conservative, or like I guess that's not really a relevant term there, but they were reliable soldiers who could be trusted to side with the lords over the peasantry. And so, yeah, so they're well-off farmers, right? And in the sort of American context, Jefferson thought of the American like petty producers, like the smallholding farmers, as yeoman farmers, right? That America could be a yeoman republic, right? And so this gets back to the Californian ideology, right? Where the authors of that article describe how that yeoman ethos, or that Jeffersonian ethos, was so prevalent in early tech, in like the 1990s tech sector. Really, this article is kind of using the history of open source to question that assumption and sort of reevaluate what the real position of coders is.
Yeah, so like it's sort of it seems to suggest that like because like the yeoman sort of thing doesn't seem to actually be the case, but like it might be that some coders, like the sort of coders involved in open source, more closely resemble like artisanal workers, which is kind of funny because like I remember like a good couple of years ago, like maybe 5 years back, the JavaScript sort of world was really taken by this sort of surge of like libraries and library authors describing their work as like artisanal, like handcrafted artisanal JavaScript. And I think it was partially just an uptick in the kind of like general hipsterness that was characteristic of about 5 years ago. But like it's interesting because you can kind of see the mask slip a bit there, right? That like people's true desires were revealed, right? That like, and I think this I think the reason that like a lot of people do open source work is because they do desire a kind of mode of production and a sort of relationship to their product that's much closer to what artisans had, which is to say that it's less alienated, right? Like because the majority of actual tech work in the real world is this kind of like very drab sort of factory labor almost, where you have just sort of spend your days wiring libraries together and there's not much autonomy to it. But what we're trying to get at here with this like yeoman and artisanal stuff is that like those categories of people had more autonomy than the lower masses did, and had more of a sort of a say in what was going on, or just a teeny bit more power.
Yeah, it's they were producers. They weren't, shopkeepers or something like that, but they were nevertheless quite privileged compared to your average peasant. And that sort of does square with the position of tech workers in that period from like the mid 90s into like the next 15 years or so, right? Like this sort of privilege stratum of the working class, and the point of view of many tech workers at that time was sort of consonant with this kind of Jeffersonian conservatism, right? Like they saw themselves as different from your average rabble and tended to support property capital over labor.
Yeah, and like we covered a lot of that in the episode 2, like almost a year ago, or 9 months ago, with like about when we were talking about the Californian ideology. But like even then it was sort of concluded that like that's a fairly hollow and contradictory sort of set of ideas that were being held by those people, because like there's like this notion of like these digital artisans and all this sort of stuff, or like the yeoman sort of code plowsman out on the wild frontier. It's kind of not actually the case at all, right? Like that the huge majority of this actual industry is just sort of like proletarian like labor with no adornments, right? Like, and I mean, yeah, it's slightly above the sort of level of like, God, I don't know, like a journalist or a teacher or almost any other career you can name, because like that's actually something I get out of my, like, a lot of my colleagues, the remarks along the lines of that this tech stuff like is kind of absurd in its sort of like being like just that little bit above the most other careers that are actually available. But there's not really that much in the way of actual autonomy to it, right? Because like any other worker, we receive instruction from on high and carry it out, with like not a huge amount of actual leeway. So it's kind of interesting that like I kind of like have a hard time sort of agreeing fully with the article, because like in my experience, like the majority of coders are neither yeoman nor artisan, right?
Yeah, and I guess an interesting point that sort of came up in our readings regarding that is like the effect that the success of open source has had on that dynamic, right? Because in this Ford Foundation report that the Jacobin article cites, the report is called Roads and Bridges, and it's a report that's basically looking at the problem of open source software not being adequately funded and given enough sort of infrastructural support, and how that creates problems for capitalism, right? Because it's a Ford Foundation, they're trying to figure out how to address the contradictions of capitalism to the advantage of capital. That's what they do. So this report talks about how the success of GitHub, right, coming back to GitHub, and the success of Stack Exchange did sort of popularize open source software and create a lot more workplaces where they didn't have that ban, right? Like maybe they had a ban on GPL, but they didn't have a ban on other open source licenses, right? It wasn't a Microsoft thing where you had to have, Microsoft licensed stuff only, .NET only, that kind of thing. And so that was a great victory, in a sense, for these coders who wanted to have more control over their own stack, right? Like what software were they using? They wanted to be able to hack on the software that they were using themselves, right? Like, they wanted that kind of autonomy, that artisanal autonomy that we've been talking about. But part of being an artisan is having trade secrets. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yeah, pretty much,
like,
right?
The master has to have something to teach the apprentice that is protected information and knowledge. Otherwise, there is no guild, right? Like, the guild falls apart because what becomes common knowledge no longer has the value it used to have. And in that success of seeing open source explode and seeing GitHub and Stack Exchange become these kind of clearinghouses for the general intellect, they in many ways coders undermined the material conditions for their own production of the commons, right? So they went from a position of being marginalized, right, and under sort of like legal and rhetorical threat from capital, to being in a position of being embraced by capital, but then seeing the conditions of production that they had before evaporate. Because what happened was, capital was like, okay, like there's this huge commons that's available. Like, I see your point. This is obviously valuable. There's like a number of benefits to using open source software. That all makes sense. So what we're going to do is we're going to hire a bunch of new coders because your labor costs are too high. And we're just going to get them to copy and paste and sort of assemble little bits and pieces of the code that you have created in the commons, right? And you get a stratified tech sector in this arrangement, where there are the sort of remnants or kind of like privileged stratum of coders who actually, at some deep level, understand coding, right? They understand how to hack. They have enough resources, ideally at least, to maintain what they make, and are producing the sort of backbone projects that other coders download from GitHub and stick together into something that their bosses need, right?
Yeah, that is absolutely stuff that I recognize from my own career. Like, definitely that. Like, when I got into the sort of tech world, I came in at that sort of level of like taking the open source stuff as the default. Like, I got into like Ruby and Python and all this sort of stuff. Definitely regarded the proprietary stuff with major suspicion, but it took a long time to realize that actually, like, although like at the back of my mind there was always the words open source, like thrumming away in the background, that the actual day-to-day mechanics of doing the job had nothing to do with that, right? Like your interaction with open source was to pull a library from GitHub or from the sort of the repository, but that the actual job was simply wiring libraries together. Really, like, there was actually very little in the way of like novel design work to be done in sort of satisfying business needs. And yeah, like we then sort of look upwards to this. Like, I think there is definitely a kind of pseudo artisan tier that are like, yeah, like you said, are kind of like maintained by these massive corporations. Like, I suppose the people that develop all the big JavaScript frameworks and what have you. But
yeah, I mean, a big sort of thing to point to is like how, you know, the Linux Foundation brags about how much of Linux kernel development is corporate supported, right? That there is actual money coming in to support the open source development of the Linux kernel.
Yeah. I've just thought of a slightly more sort of obscure example, but like the kind of story of Foundation DB is pretty interesting, where it was like a really, really cool set of database technologies. But apparently, like, basically the timeline is that like the core developers like developed it when they were in school, more or less, and like got a start on it, like founded a company to develop it a bit further, and then got acquired by Apple, and it was all brought in-house. And they've been working on it since. Like, that was a good 7 years ago. And then this year it was re-open sourced from Apple. So it was so fucking valuable that they bought the project and dragged it in-house. And like, there was a big kerfuffle when that happened, because all their repos got deleted off of GitHub and stuff. And like, it all went in interior, right? But so they've been essentially just bankrolled outright by Apple, and like internally, apparently, like Foundation DB is the kind of bedrock of iTunes and that sort of stuff. So yeah, Apple poured money into developing this technology that was initially developed by like child geniuses, essentially. But the point is that, like, I mean, me and my colleagues and the sort of people around me, sort of like, I think a lot of us wonder, like, how do we get to that tier? Like, how do we get out of this fucking grind of just sort of doing sort of mediocre sort of work that doesn't have a lot of prospect for that kind of autonomy? And like the answer is you don't, right? Because what happens is you get born as those Foundation DB guys or whatever, and you're either on that trajectory into that kind of upper tier of like. Either those guys, or like the kind of conference circuit dudes who are like, most of their job is actually kind of doing like developer relations and like pimping out these like JavaScript frameworks or whatever. But yeah, so that we are kind of raised to believe that there is this kind of we're all in this big community together, right? Like this open source community, and that if you pitch in and you sort of do your bit, then you kind of get the good stuff. The good stuff is implied to be, you know, jobs or whatever, or like kind of high flying positions. But the reality seems to be much closer to like, yeah, there is a small cadre of like artisans at that kind of like very high tier, like getting like a tier that's high enough that you can have all your flights and tickets paid for to go to conferences, right? Like that's quite a bit above what most people's experience of their workplace actually is. And then the rest of us are, honest to God, just ordinary workers who aren't going to become startup billionaires. And it might be healthy to acknowledge that, for the rest of us. That
right. So I think that that's absolutely correct, and there's really sort of 2 points there that come up in the readings we did, which are, one, to what extent are those sort of like core artisanal workers just not compensated for their work, right? Like they're, the big one that people point to is like OpenSSL, right? Like prior to the core infrastructure initiative, there was this really important open source library called OpenSSL, and it was just this poor guy slaving around away on this thing so that multi-billion-dollar corporations could just unthinkingly employ his work day in, day out without any compensation at all, right? And it just basically got to a point of absolute desperation. And I believe that was that was all, like the whole thing went down with like the Heartbleed bug. Is that correct?
Yeah. So that was So for a bit of clarity, like OpenSSL is a security and cryptography technology that secures like basically all communications on the planet by this point. It's impossible to use a piece of technology without your data traveling through something that pipes through OpenSSL. And when you're in a web browser and you get that little green padlock at the top left, that's kind of backed by that as well. But it turned out there were gaping holes in this thing, and like that's fine because like it was one or two dudes who were working full time and getting like no support whatsoever.
And so you have that kind of like quote unquote artisanal labor. I don't know if that's even an appropriate analogy because it's not like they had a patron they were working for, customers, right?
They very much didn't have a patron.
They were doing it out of like volunteer labor. Yeah. Versus say like the core developer of like Go, right? Which is like a very different kind of arrangement. Both open source projects, right? But very, very different arrangements. So that is a divide to consider. And there are a lot of developers out there who started up these open source projects as things that they were doing out of interest. They blew up, and then they end up with a huge headache of having support requests to answer from multi-billion-dollar corporations who aren't paying them anything to to actually answer the support requests, right? So like that whole dynamic is there, and then also you have the dynamic between the established open source developers at these mega corporations who are in a very different position from your sort of gluing frameworks together, average proletariat coders, right? Yeah. So there's a lot of questions that come up about what the actual state of the industry is, but there's a general sense that there's kind of a crisis going on of the infrastructure not really being sustainable, and that there's all these questions of how do you have sort of quote unquote communist production, right? Like production for a commons in a capitalist system, right? That's kind of what it comes down to. And the answer is typically you need patronage, right? You need the people who actually have capital, right? The capitalist class, the people who actually, accrue the benefits of surplus value, to redistribute that value to the producers in the commons in order to make sure that the commons can work. And this is a question that comes up with regards to say road maintenance or the development of science, right? Like, because this is a similar field, right? That to scientific production, where there was this huge question in the 20th century of like, how do we support scientific development, right? In the absence of it being run by gentlemen scholars who live off of the produce of their tenants and of the workers who provide them surplus value, how do we support science? And so it was a contradiction, right? Because capitalism doesn't have an affordance for that kind of production, right? Like you could try to license out everything and make it all very proprietary and so on and so forth. But the actual solutions that they ended up with was like semi-corporate, semi-state sponsorship of science, right? And that's an ongoing contradiction. But it's a serious problem, and it goes beyond just the internal structure of the workforce in tech and into sort of like broader questions of the entire sustainability of this system of production.
Yeah, it's really, really tricky because like I think it also sort of gives us maybe some indication of the kind of problems we need to think about with like going forward into a sort of glorious communist future, where like this is an example of a field in which you have kind of strange relations to production, where like the thing you're producing isn't strictly a commodity because it's not destroyed on use, and it's like there's non-linearities introduced because copying a software artifact is essentially costless. And like it's sort of like we already see that like existing companies interacting with open source have this really hard time accounting for what they're actually using. When the question comes up of like, how are we going to get these companies to like contribute back a fair proportion of their revenue to this commons that they're harvesting from, it's actually really hard to even answer the question of what are they harvesting.
Yeah, it's like it's like when Marx talks about how like science is like a free gift to capital.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, basically. Like that's exactly.
It's like I don't know. Code comes in, code goes out. Whatever. As long as we're getting money from our clients, it doesn't matter. Right?
I mean, pretty much right. So like I think the question, the problem would solve itself in a like totally automated, like post-value form communized society. But in the interim, like in the very immediate future of like how to make this kind of production work in the immediate future, and also like as a case study for the kind of problems we're going to hit with converting a high-tech society to a like post-money, post-value sort of a system of organization. This is kind of instructive, and very, very tricky, which is the kind of upsetting part, because I just don't know, like how you kind of square that those kind of circles.
Yeah, and I mean, in the Ford Foundation report, they say things like, oh, well, we need metrics of use to see which projects are actually like keystone projects that need sponsorship, need patronage. But I mean, there's going to be contradictions implied in that as well, right?
Well, right. So like, I mean, like I was kind of remarking in the green room that like it's on this point of like, measuring the actual usage of the infrastructure. It's kind of strange because you would think that a company like Red Hat or Canonical would be in a good position to do that sort of thing in the current system, but they don't. And like, I mean, it is what it is. But even if they did, like, if the package installer reports that you installed, gosh, I don't know, like MySQL and OpenSSL, like, okay, fine. But like, in what proportion are those actually used to create the value that the new product is creating? And I don't know, it seems really hard to kind of actually track down exactly what the sort of meaning of that is. But the recommendations here at the sort of end of that report are kind of like quite inoffensive. Like, I mean, there's like building awareness and educating key stockholders of like, that is a good point though, because like, I mean, people were unaware of the OpenSSL problem until it became a glaring problem, like a radiant white hot problem that nobody could ignore anymore.
Yes, so I mean, especially outside of tech companies, there are many companies that use open source and have like only the dimmest conception of how all this stuff works, right? So yes, it is possible to sort of like boost up the profile of these projects and get corporations in other sectors of the economy to maybe chip in some money to help out the developers, and like whatever, okay, that's fine. But I think fundamentally, it's not going to solve these issues. But to sort of get back to this point of the labor force, right, and of organizing strategy, like what, because like we have these Ford Foundation suggestions about like, oh well, we need metrics, we need patronage, we need blah blah blah. Well, the proposal that is given by this Jacobin article, the Mueller article, is of a centrally organized and democratic tech sector, which might solve many significant problems with software that neither the voluntaristic open source ethos or the profit maximizing prerogatives can address, right? So, okay, right? Like, like if we think about what does communist tech labor look like, we need to think about what organizing looks like. And we talked a little bit about organizing in our Notes from Below episode, right? But I think that this is, whereas that article we read in the Notes from Below episode was looking at tech as an industry, this is very much more like looking at coding as a craft, right? It's looking only at that like productive workers subsection of the tech industry, and what their suggestion is, what Mueller's suggestion is here, is to say like, okay, well, what if we sort of, instead of framing tech workers as yeomen, right, as Jeffersonian individuals homesteading on the digital frontier, what if we frame them as sort of Proudhonist artisans, right? And so, Proudhon was one of like the earliest anarchists. He was very popular among like the sort of working and artisan class of Paris in the sort of mid to late 19th century. And he's quite well known for his sort of maxim that property is theft. But generally speaking, he was interested in a society of sort of small producers who were working in like a fair and just marketplace, right? And it's comprehensible when you think about like, okay, well, if you assume that tech workers are in this kind of privileged sort of artisanal position, right? And that this has led them to sort of Jeffersonian thinking. Like, why don't we instead appeal to, sort of their common interests as workers of small producers who are in relatively privileged status, just like Proudhon did in Paris back in the day, right? Like, because, he was appealing to workers in small workshops who, yes, they weren't incredibly well off, but they were certainly better off than many of the peasants out in the countryside. The sort of problems, though, are the problems we've already talked about, right? The problems of, well, what about all these coders who are just copying and pasting code together and assembling bits of libraries? Like, they seem to be much more amenable to a kind of more modern organizing strategy, the kind of industrial organizing strategy that we talked about in Notes from Below, than a craft unionism. Or basically a craft unionism kind of strategy. So in addition to that, there's the question of what do you do about those coders who actually are in a privileged position, right? Like the sort of artisans who do have big time corporate sponsorship, right? The Linux kernel developers, the core Go development team at Google. Are those people just sort of irredeemably tied to the interests of capital, or are they not? Because there's a divide in the workforce, and how do you address that divide? That seems to be a significant organizing issue that that this article in particular doesn't really get into.
Yeah, and it's a really interesting problem, right? And like I would like to hope that the latter category aren't kind of beyond reaching, but I think I was going to kind of suggest that the open source ethos has always had this sort of like inherently sort of left wing ideology to it, it's not an accident that Stallman called it copy left, right? But I have also encountered more than enough kind of people who are like weirdly like extreme fans of Stallman and like are like hardcore committed to all those kind of like socialized sort of code sort of principles, but are also like kind of right-wing reactionaries and like deeply resent the suggestion that open source is a sort of like communistic endeavor, right? So maybe people aren't exactly beyond being completely fucking overwhelmed by contradictory ideologies, I don't know.
Well, yeah, and I think that maybe gets to that idea of sort of like trade secrets, right? Craft interest, right? That because it's perfectly possible to have craft unionists who are extremely reactionary, right? Like, because the thing is, like, yes, like generally in free and open software, open source software, it is the case that enthusiasts want to spread the use of the software as far as possible. But like, a thing you often encounter as well is that it's deeply elitist, and it is people are very tied up with their status as quote unquote technical people, and very tied up with that idea that they are not just your average schlub, right? Like, so it is possible to have a commons within a clearly delineated sector of society that nevertheless promotes rather reactionary thinking, right? Like, it's perfectly possible for giant corporations to found a cooperative, right? Like, look at Best Western. Best Western is a cooperative, right? It's an owner's cooperative. It is not a progressive political organization, right? So sharing does not necessarily imply left-wing politics. Yeah,
definitely. And like, I was just sort of thinking there that like, there's also the kind of angle where, like, generally trying to get through to someone by appealing to them / admonishing them for like being in a privileged position is a real fucking dice roll, because sometimes they'll listen and they'll sit there and do the mental calculus and they'll go, yeah, you know what, I am in a privileged position and I'm going to fucking pull up the drawbridge.
Where does that really get you anyway?
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Like, it's like, I mean, I have no interest in sort of like privilege guilt politics. Like, I mean, that is not going to alter the situation. It's just going to be like, oh, well, I am pretty well off, aren't I? I guess I should donate to charity. It's like, okay, I mean, fine, whatever. But that is not an organizing strategy. Right? Definitely not, no, because
it can. So like, I think, but to kind of touch back to what we're talking about here, that like, I think it could be actually kind of dangerous to appeal to this yeoman / artisanal sort of thing of like trying to reinforce that coders are a sort of special class that have this unique position. I think it's probably much more fruitful to radicalize the sort of vast base of like ordinary proletarian workers of coders, that like who really honestly don't have that sort of artisanal positioning, and who in fact yearn for it, right? Like that's why people go home at the weekend to hack on small open source projects or to like contribute to things, because they sort of do yearn for right. So that's the thing, right? That like people do yearn for non-alienated labor, right? Like, and for to not be quite so miserable about what they spend their time doing. I think you could channel that away from the current way it's channeled, where the promise is that if you contribute to the community and if you play ball and if you are a good player in this sort of open source world, then you'll be rewarded with a job or whatever, or you'll be rewarded with notoriety and all this kind of stuff. Oh, like you'll be the next cool guy who invents the next cool programming language. It's be channeled away from that sort of stuff, because it's ultimately a hollow promise, right? Like you're not gonna rise out of the ranks, right? Like you're a schlub just like me and everyone else, but channel it instead into like actual kind of class consciousness, that like, no, like let's be realistic about what our relation is to our work and to our employers, and kind of crack on with the job of organizing around those actualities instead of around the kind of illusions of the Silicon Valley promise.
Yeah, and it like, sort of 2 points there. One is like, yes, that sort of gets back to this idea of industrial unionism that we saw in Notes from Below. And second, it's not the case that privileged, or I don't know how to say privileged, but that well-to-do or
not completely immiserated.
Yeah, strata of the working class who are relatively well off are not necessarily always reactionary. That's just simply not true, right? Like, you look at railway workers who are very much like the coders of the late 19th, early 20th century, and who, like, they had the same thing, which was control over a major infrastructure system, right? And that did give them a relatively privileged status. But they were also, quite militant and often communist. Like, even now, you look at, like, what is the group of workers that is at the forefront of fighting Macron in France? It's the railway workers, right? And, like, in Japan, when the Japanese government privatized the JR, and they broke the unions, that was like a notoriously violent and horrible episode, which is what they had to do in order to break them, because they had power, right? And that didn't mean that they were just reactionary yeomen, right? So it's not impossible for a sort of cross working class alliance to be developed. It's just a question of how to do it.
And that actually reminds me, and we can close a big loop that's been open for the entire running of the series. That was actually one of the sort of inspirations for wanting to do the show in the first place. That like, I'd kind of noticed that in a lot of left podcasts or whatever, or a lot of left sort of discourse, the sort of meme of the kind of like Silicon Valley chud was, or the sort of Silicon Valley reactionary was becoming a bit too sort of prevalent. And I kind of thought that, like, it really can't be the case that, like exactly what you described, it can't be the case that anyone who's not, working minimum wage is by default a reactionary. And in fact, like, for right. for an actual positive program to, get us into a post-value form communism or whatever, you kind of need to be able to convince everyone, essentially, like to within a rounding error, right? Like everyone in the society, including, and especially probably including the upper stratum of skilled workers who, maybe don't fully identify with the sort of the very lowest tier either, that like there has to be sort of room for like convincing people in sort of like non-manual labor jobs of the value of a socialist future, right? Like that has to be the case because otherwise you're going to go fucking anarcho-primitivist or something, and that's going to be your shitty future.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
So yeah, it only took 20 episodes to close that loop, but there we are. This is kind of one of the reasons for wanting to do this. This is important stuff, right? Like the stuff that's kind of, I think it's a good article, but like the stuff that all spins out from it, like all these considerations about labor relations in high technology, are all crucial to developing a program. There's also, so like kind of later in the article, that kind of loops back around to the centralization and sort of network effects bit about the Microsoft acquisition of GitHub. on the one hand, we're meant to sort of believe that these are like mutualist sort of communities and gift economies, but like their infrastructure is entirely subsumed within capital, right? Like that to such an extent that the entirety of the infrastructure can be bought as a commodity.
Yes, it is one coherent organization.
It is a single unit that you can grab with your hand and like move somewhere else. Like it's
and generally it attempts to use free software or open source software to create sort of like self-hosted alternatives and stuff. Like, yeah, they find some purchase here and there when there's like a scandal. Like I remember back, I don't remember exactly when it was like in the early 2010s, there was like a major scandal with GitHub, and then like some people moved over to, what was it, like
GitLab.
Was it?
Yeah.
GitLab, yeah. GitLab sort of grew in adoption a little bit, but then people just went back to GitHub, right? Like the network effects are real and powerful.
GitLab are sort of an interesting example of a company that sort of manages to navigate these pathways with some sort of grace. That like it's essentially an open core model where like there is an open source version that is like 90% of the features, and then there's the paid version, which is the last 10%. Or you can get like licensing, or like you can get a support contract for the full version that you host yourself and such. And that seems to be like a relatively promising way of, in the short term, making these kind of companies work, where they are committed to creating this commons, but also like feeding themselves, Yes,
it definitely has its uses, but there is a section in the Ford Foundation report about why that is not a generally viable business strategy. So like, it works best in industries where, yeah, you can provide a service contract, or if this one thing fails, your production is going to seize up completely, right? So, like, if GitLab goes down, or if there's a major bug introduced into GitLab, and there isn't adequate, labor hours behind getting things fixed, that is going to seize up your entire infrastructure, right? Your production is just going to quit working, right? If it is something that is less, like either less frequently updated or less forward-facing, or something that is maybe a part of your project but not absolutely core, it's much harder to use that kind of business model. But it does work for some organizations, absolutely.
Yeah. I guess that sort of explains why they're like every feature release they've had recently is all like new project management and workflow stuff, like really burrowing into that kind of position of being the essential part of infrastructure that you just can't do without.
And it's like, another example is Red Hat, right? Red Hat is in a similar kind of position, and is also a open source company, or even like a free software company that has made a go of it. But like after Red Hat, there have been pretty much like just a handful of successful Linux companies that have come along, right?
Because like you've got Canonical with Ubuntu, but then that's basically bankrolled by Shuttleworth. Like he's a billionaire in his own right, and he just sort of feeds money to the organization, so it doesn't seem to be actually all that successful.
And to the extent that it is successful, it's successful in terms of its server side stuff, right? Which was not the intention of the company getting off the ground. So there's limitations on that kind of model, which is why the Ford Foundation report sort of gets back to this idea of patronage, because like, yeah, that'll work for some companies, but it's not going to work for everybody.
Yeah, so I guess like. I don't know. Like I was going to sort of ask, like, well, what do we sort of do for a sort of socialist vision of this sort of stuff? And
well, I mean, I think one thing is, at the very least, we can say that in a socialist system, the person who is hacking away on an open source passion project is not going to have to start a GoFundMe to pay for their funeral costs. right?
Yeah,
like,
definitely not.
Like the Ford Foundation approach is to say like, oh, well, we need to like find keystone projects and target them and support those people. And it's like, well, maybe, but also like, what if we just made it so that people didn't starve if they didn't have a job? Right, like that is a minimum thing that we could do in order to support positive, sustainable open source development.
Yeah, I guess I was sort of like missing the wood for the trees there a bit of like, well, wondering what this kind of high tech sort of work looks like in the sort of deep future. But like,
that's the future.
that's the immediate sort of thing of like, well, people not starving while they try to maintain the infrastructure that powers so much other sort of endeavors would be, pretty good.
Yeah, that's at least something we could point to is like, okay, maybe even if you are a rather well-to-do tech worker, maybe you don't want the contributors to your project to be starving to death.
Probably not, no,
yeah.
Because starving people don't do all that sort of great work, especially not for the intellectual sort of stuff. Yeah, like is there anything we've sort of missed that we should kind of go over? I'm kind of aware that like there's a lot of spindly sort of issues that branch out in all sorts of different directions from this stuff.
Yeah, I feel like it's a little bit too, as you say, spindly or just diffuse. There's too many tangents you could go down with this. I think we should just wrap it here and see what people have to say about it.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, I think like if I have a feeling this one might spawn some sort of like incoming kind of comments or whatever. But yeah, if listeners do have anything to kind of contribute, do ping us on Twitter or whatever. We're on Twitter at GI Unit Pod. We're on Facebook as General Intellect Unit, and I don't know. We're on all the podcasting apps, so you can kind of subscribe and download all the other episodes if you haven't done so already. And yeah, definitely get in touch if you've got some sort of insight into any particular bit of this that we might have missed, or just a perspective on where you might see this going in the future. Because I do sort of maintain that this is like perhaps a really interesting sort of case study, or like open source in general is an interesting case study of like the intersection of like high tech production and a sort of commons. That could inform some sort of like research for what fully automated luxury communism might look like, but I think we're a bit away from that at the moment. And also, like if you have been enjoying the show, maybe think about going to patreon.com/generalintellectunit and throwing us a few bucks a month to disalienate us from our labor. It helps to pay for like server costs and all this sort of stuff, and for buying books, which are super expensive.
Yes.
But yeah, I guess that's it. So yeah, thanks listeners for coming along with us, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks.
Bye.